Now let me introduce Dr. Goutam Ghoshal, another guest for today's session. He's a professor in Department of English, Vishwa Bharati, a Central University, Shantiniketan. Apart from Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, his areas of interest include 19th century British and American literature, Shakespeare's poetry, and Rabindra Sangeet. Ghoshal's books include Sri Aurobindo's prose style, Sri Aurobindo and world literature, notes on prayers and meditations, Rainbow Bridge, a comparative study of Tagore and Sri Aurobindo and others. He is a co-editor of the first reprint of James Cousin's 1917 book, New Ways in English Literature, which came out recently with a long introduction to Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry, which the book has initiated. Dr. Ghoshal has lectured at various universities in India and abroad. A hearty welcome to you, sir. With this, I now request Professor Goutam Ghoshal to give the keynote address.
Thank you very much. And my pranam to my mentor and my teacher, R.Y. Deshpande. Perhaps the greatest living Savitri scholar in the planet. He is not just a living encyclopedia of Savitri, but his interpretation, his commentaries, and it's very, very, it takes a lot of guts to speak in front of him. But he taught me for the first time that the future poetry is not Sri Aurobindo's final concept of poetry. It was R.Y. Deshpande, it was not my original view. People now are taking it as my view, but it is not my view. It was R.Y. Deshpande who once in Mother India office told me that, Goutam, see, future poetry is not a complete manifesto of Sri Aurobindo's poetry. You have to take the letters of Setna and you have to take them together and try to find out what is his final view of poetry. So that way I continued my research. Now, as the title of the seminar is Kavi, so let me be, because I speak in very clear terms and not trying to make it very complicated, because as an interpreter, you should be clear. You should not write like someone, my friend was asked in Los Angeles, can you please translate this into English? So, and it was by an American, and he asked my friend that, can you please translate this into English? So this is not the approach, because Sri Aurobindo himself is, you have to wrestle with him a lot. Then you shouldn't be, as far as you know, you should be clear and put it like this. So now the word Kavi in classical Sanskrit, it meant any maker of prose and verse. But in Vedic Sanskrit, in ancient Sanskrit, the word meant the person who just saw and sang. He had no other function. He was not a philosopher. He was not a thinker. He was not a logical analyzer of truth. So the thinking mind was not at all there. And he was a singer. Notice when Sri Aurobindo praises Tagore, he calls him a poet singer. When he appreciates Whitman as the pioneer of the new poetry, he calls him poet singer. So this musical quality is part of this mantric poetry. Now, there are different kinds of vision. And our students have to take care of this. Vision is, it can be revelation, it can be prayer, it can be incantation, it can be magic, as Ravinda has cited Keats's lines from Immortality Ode, magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in the fairy lands forlorn. And also there is one, my own example, because Setna taught me a little to characterize. So my own example is from Ode to Psyche, where Keats writes, ah, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in. So these are the things which go against T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry, which was almost parallelly written to Sri Aurobindo's future poetry, because T.S. Eliot wrote Tradition and Individual Talent in 1919, and Sri Aurobindo started the future poetry in 1917. Now, I have been claiming for the last few years and that Sri Aurobindo places poetry at the center of knowledge. This is with reference to Sri Aurobindo's claim or disclaim that he is not a philosopher proper. I am primarily a poet and a politician. About politician, I may speak on another occasion, because I am into whole of him. But today it is on the poetry. Why does he call himself, I am primarily a poet and not a philosopher? Because he has written more than 50,000 lines of blank verse, narrative, lyric, romances, sonnets, and epic. But he has written also plenty of prose, a large amount, and vast structures from 1914 to 1921. So if one notices clearly, one finds that this man is writing not from books, but from experience. And his language is definitely intellectual and logical, but something else is supporting his language, something which is beyond intellect, something which is intellect and at the same time beyond intellect. For instance, the essays on the Gita or the synthesis of yoga. My example is from 2 or 3 chapters from the synthesis of yoga, because I don't want to confuse you. You are listening and I'm not writing, I'm speaking. And there are two major chapters in the synthesis of yoga. First part on sacrifice and the ascent of sacrifice. And there Sri Aurobindo's language is only prose by courtesy. It is not prose. There's plenty of logic, argument is there. But still, it is only prose by courtesy when he speaks of sacrifice, the doctrine of sacrifice, and the ascent of sacrifice. If you go back this evening and give a look at that, you will see that much of the structure is based on poetry. Same is with Life Divine, Essays on the Gita, and even Human Cycle, where it is very logical. But in Human Cycle, he says, linking with his future poetry, that poetry is not a notch-girl of the mind. It is something else. So because something has to be revealed, something must rise from the fountainhead of the spirit, and it must come without the intervention of the intellect or the minimum supervision of the intellect, and it would be like that. So this poetry is not intellectual poetry proper, and it goes against T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry. That may be one reason why Sri Aurobindo does not speak much on T.S. Eliot. His last references in future poetry is to Yeats, to the Irish poets, to Meredith, whom he calls poets of the decline, the later Victorian period. And now you all know that Sri Aurobindo was between two ages. He was sandwiched between two ages, the modern and the Victorian, and that affected his poetic style. So when he speaks of vision, in fact, the future poetry may not be the final version of Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry, but the future poetry is the mines of gold and diamond, because you can't afford to ignore any line from the future poetry. It is thick with reference. One of the two difficult books, the most difficult, I think, some chapters are the Foundations of Indian Culture, even more difficult than the Life Divine. And the future poetry is also at times, it takes a sudden leap. And unless one is continuously absorbed and habituated with Sri Aurobindo's vibration of language, it's very difficult because it doesn't come by intellect. He is clear, running clear, then suddenly he takes a leap, even in the future poetry. So it will be interesting that the future poetry comes at the end of his great series, Life Divine, Essays on the Gita, Synthesis of Yoga, Human Cycle, and parallelly with the Foundations of Indian Culture, almost Foundations of Indian Culture started in 1918 and the future poetry started in 1917. And so this comes as a final statement of Sri Aurobindo, and this convinces me that Sri Aurobindo places poetry at the center of knowledge as the divine Agni, the Vedic fire, which purifies consciousness. It is not, and that is why I in the last lecture I said you have to read all the major books of Sri Aurobindo before taking up the future poetry.
Absolutely.
Because it is not that you introduce future poetry in our syllabus and you leave out all the major texts. No, you have to read all the major prose works, then you can understand future poetry better. Because as Deshpandeji had suggested to me once, that you see he has referred to the planes, the overmind, the illumine mind, the intuition, higher mind, all in the life divine. But when he comes to the future poetry, he is blank, he is unable. And Deshpandiji said that there is a problem of expression, and it is now permissible to speak of Sri Aurobindo's limitation. He is a god, he is an avatar. But he is, as a man, as a poet, as a critic, we have to see him. And Deshpandiji said, I said, he didn't. Deshpandiji said, no, he couldn't. Because many writers, many great writers have problems. Shakespeare's early poetry is just flop. Suddenly he takes a leave from 1597, 1598. And that happened. Sri Aurobindo is a late bloomer. And so he came to realize, Professor Gokak once said to me that maybe it was the mother's influence that made him so clear and so expressive about what he wanted to say. He knew about the planes, but he could not explain the planes. And talking of the overmind inspiration as mantra in the future poetry, he uses the word supermind. So it's a technical mistake even for Sri Aurobindo's part, because the supermind is unexpressed. I will show you the chapter where he says this. He uses the word supermind. Now, overmind contains some of the vibrations of the supermind. It is in the borderline, it is on the gateway. It must be having something of the supermind principles. But Sri Aurobindo specifically uses the word supermind instead of overmind. So something is confusing in the future poetry. That doesn't mean the future poetry is a small book. It is a major classic, because there are other things, like in the essence of poetry in chapter 2 or 3 in the future poetry, the entire expressed and unexpressed philosophy, aesthetics of Anandabardhan and Abhinavagupta are explained in the chapter Essence of Poetry. So somehow he blends the ancient and the classical Sanskrit, and he makes out. And about vision, he speaks of another thing. Vision sometimes come as thought images, not as revelations. How? Let me give my example. If you read Blake's London, you will see that Blake is giving out his experience about the degeneration of society in London, and his vision is far deeper than any other sociologist. That is vision. So vision, I quote from Sri Aurobindo, vision as thought images. That comes somewhere in the early part of the future poetry. Now, that is when one sees the inner structure of society, then you become a great sociologist, and then you become a poet, and then you become a visionary poet. Now, about the future poetry, it was from the modern point of view, uh, uh, from the recent uh, uh, things in the academics, that Sri Aurobindo gives a post-colonial resistance to all things European and all things outside. He doesn't give any resistance to America, because I have seen that his passion for Whitman. In fact, Whitman is his poetic predecessor. Whitman is extremely important. And Martha Orton has praised Sharoni extremely, because she said, Sharoni, you have introduced Whitman to America. Now this Whitman, Emerson, and all these transcendentalists, Sri Aurobindo is not giving them resistance because they are in line with Sri Aurobindo. He is putting up resistance against the Europeans. And the future poetry is like a slap on their face that, yes, see how we have seen kids, and let me show you how you should see kids. Now, they said Keats is a writer of sensuous beauty. Only Sri Aurobindo, for the first time and for the last time, nobody has clarified it. Sri Aurobindo makes a gradation of beauty in John Keats. Very short piece in the future poetry, 2 or 3 pages. But he says there is a gradation of beauty in John Keats's poetry. That is absolutely missing in the critics like Sidney Colvin, Douglas Bush, and even Bhavatos Chatterjee of Bengal, who are the leading Keats critics. So something, and Kenneth Muir could only say that Keats reached the limit of his experience. But about beauty, they stuck to that one thing, sensuous beauty. Sri Aurobindo said, no, Keats had 4 patterns of beauty, and towards the last he was moving the ideal of the divine beauty. Although the basis is the sensuous beauty, but there is imaginative beauty, there is intellectual beauty, there is ideal beauty, intuitive beauty. So these planes, this is why Shishir Kumar Ghosh had called another neglected critic of Sri Aurobindo. Very neglected, but outstanding critic of Sri Aurobindo. Outstanding, neglected because he was critic, and in those days it was not permissible to speak against Sri Aurobindo. Now we are doing this, of course, not in the way some foreigners have done. They have attacked Sri Aurobindo's life. We don't do that. We are looking at his work as a human being, what he has done. Because the avatar, well, he suffers in human form, but he also suffers as a poet and a critic. So there's a post-colonial resistance by the future poetry. He wants to show them. And you must have seen the structure of the foundations of Indian culture, which is very complex at times. And he did anything with the language. In Bengali, we say, bhasha niye ja khushi tai koreche. He did anything with the language, foundations of Indian culture, the structure, the syntax. And it is not permissible, or one shouldn't prescribe the foundations of Indian culture, especially the early part, for any text, because it is very difficult. Sri Aurobindo was angry. Sri Aurobindo was defending, and he was very angry, and he tried to show them, see what I can do with your language. So that way, in many parts of on the foundations of Indian culture, the structure and the syntax are even more difficult than that we see in the Life Divine and Essays on the Gita. Now, this is the post-colonial resistance from the colonial age, that see, we are not your subordinate. Bhima is not only the epic character, because it is not Achilles. Violence is not Indian ethos. And he stresses on the non-violence in classical Sanskrit drama, in the dramas of Kalidasa. The benign, soft, kind, mellow sensitivity. And when somebody compared with the age of the Elizabeth, Sri Aurobindo said it's a totally different ethos, because Elizabethan age was culturally very, very inferior. It was all bloodshed, violence, everything. Even Matthew Arnold, who compared the two ages, the Pericles of Athens and the age of Elizabeth in England, Matthew Arnold compared this in his essay on the modern elements in literature. And Arnold said the Pericles of Athens is far superior in culture to the age of Elizabeth in England. Only Shakespeare says. So this culture is not the culture of Kalidasa. This is not the culture of this benign, soft, loving, romantic spirit of, because you can't think a woman, he wants to pluck out the eyes of another guy in Measure for Measure. That is one of the most dark comedies of Shakespeare. Now, coming to Sri Aurobindo's vision as a Kavi, it is related to his to his aspect of criticism. When it comes to Shakespeare, he has the entire body of Shakespearean aesthetics. Very few people know that Sri Aurobindo is the leading critic of Shakespeare from India, because he has a whole body of aesthetics on Shakespeare. This is still unknown. I have been trying to do this for the last 15 years. That Sri Aurobindo, no, he is not just a critic, but he has given us an entire aesthetics on the greatest dramatic poet of the world. And Sri Aurobindo uses two words from the Upanishads, Virat and Hiranyagarbha, which refers to Shakespeare. Now, people do not see how deep Sri Aurobindo is. Hiranyagarbha is, in fact, it refers to the subliminal planes. And Hiranyagarbha is Shakespeare's soliloquies. Sri Aurobindo doesn't say that. We have to interpret that Shakespeare is both Virat and Hiranyagarbha. Why does he say that? Because he is spread out all over the world. He is Virat. Hiranyagarbha, because the soliloquies speak of all the subliminal planes of Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and others, even the women. And there should be a separate study of Sri Aurobindo's view on women, because Sri Aurobindo is taking also his early poems. There should be a separate study on Sri Aurobindo's attitude to women, which must be extremely rich. And then coming to the point of this fusion, this integration, this integrality in poetry, of which Professor Gokak has written a book with reference to Coleridge. And Lawrence Buell is one of the major eco-critics of the modern times. Lawrence Buell in 1973, in his first book, Style and Vision in the American Renaissance, Literary Transcendentalism, Style and Vision in the American Renaissance. Talking of Emerson, Lawrence Buell says, the poet is he who sees the integrity of the whole landscape. And that is exactly defining Sri Aurobindo's poetry, theory of poetry. The poet is he who sees the integrity of the whole landscape. It means the inner and the outer, the higher and the lower. So Buell was extremely perceptive in catching Emerson. And I've said that Sri Aurobindo was identical with the Americans, especially the great trio of American transcendentalism, Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman. So Sri Aurobindo was not giving resistance against them. And they were also steeped in Indian culture through royal literature, because all of them read royal literature. These translations were passed in America and England also in the name of Ram Mohan Rai, and they called it royal literature. So And it also explains the issue of Kavi and Rishi, the synthesis of the word Kavi and Rishi, because Aurobindo says in the ideal spirit of poetry, perhaps one of the best clarified chapters in the future poetry, in the second part, he says the Rishi has returned again. Seeing Rabindranath Tagore, Whitman, and Carpenter, A.E. Yeats, that the Rishi has returned again. The Rishi sees life as a whole, unlike the sannyasi who leaves the world. Unless there is a completeness of vision, integrality of the whole landscape, you can't be a poet proper. So all life is yoga is not a rash statement. It sums up a lot of Sri Aurobindo, a major part of Sri Aurobindo. And then Sri Aurobindo says the lyric will be the future form. As a contradiction with modern poetry, which is now going on, the objectivity of which T.S. Eliot speaks, and which Yeats denied initially, even later. Even when he used objectivity, he was subjective. It was something like an objectivized subjectivity in Yeats's poetry. The Life Divine is an autobiography. It is an objectivized autobiography of Sri Aurobindo. Life Divine is an objective because everything is experience. Whatever comes, it comes through his experience. And he put some, and many people think that, oh, he has quoted these slokas from the Sanskrit text, so this must be a summary of this. Those slokas are the starting point of Sri Aurobindo's investigation or further investigation. A pour se move, Galileo said, the earth moves forward. And Heraclitus had said that you can't take a dip in the same water twice. So Sri Aurobindo, as an advanced, as an evolving soul, was going beyond the past scriptures. That is why it's an indication. It's not that he was writing a summary of those chapters. And the next thing is about the form. And here also, Professor Deshpande is a supreme master. So let me suggest with humility, because it's always speaking.
No, not at all.
It's always a terrible thing that I'm speaking in front of R.Y. Deshpande. So, and now Sri Aurobindo said that the lyric will be the future form and the spirit will decide the form. That speaks of the inspired creativity, the discovery even of the rhythm, of the meter, of the structure, of the shape, of everything will come through the spirit. The spirit will decide the form. You won't pre-plan it. It is not a prescience of what you are going to do. Even when Sri Aurobindo wrote Savitri, it was not a prescience always. He started writing, and where he reached, he didn't know even. There is something of, Pater speaks of two kinds of style. One is mind in style and soul in style. The mind in style is that you have a preview of the structure. And soul in style is totally inspired. You don't have a preview of the structure. Where you end, you don't know. But the charm of Sri Aurobindo is that he combines the mind in style and the soul in style. He knows that this should be the end of it. But at the same time, he is taking liberty. And is always, when he was translating things, Setna was interrupting all the time with his scholarship, great scholarship. And Sri Aurobindo says, no, keep it like that. Because it always comes when it translates, it always comes as a new discovery. So when he translates a line from Virgil and Setna intervenes, he says, no, let it be like that. Let the translation be like that. So then we come to the point between intellect and intuition. This is an important issue because it relates to Blake. In a wonderful passage in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his kavan. So this closed up, man is closed up. The modern poets are closed up because of the too much interference of the brain. And Setna has a wonderful phrase, compound word, in the preface to Overread Poetry. He says it's a brain clamped mentality. It's a brain clamped mentality because you can't go beyond the brain. So if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man infinite as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his kavan. And then I will end with a few words on overhead aesthetics with some modern references. And I have already said in my previous lectures in Pondicherry that of all the Urdu poets, I consider Shakil Badani to be the most close to Sri Aurobindo's aesthetics and most close to Sri Aurobindo's practice. Because if you compare Sahir Ludhianvi, Gulzar, they are far more popular than Shahir Ludhianvi. Because Gulzar gives a statement of life. Sahir Ludhianvi, they are good poets, even statements are good, but they are just statements, beautiful, decorative statements of life, observations of life. In the case of Shakil Badayuni, it is direct revelation. When he says, Nayano mein koi ayana duja, speaking of unadulterous love. And I have quoted quite often those lines from Holi, which summarizes the whole of Vaishnav Padabali in 2 lines. Shakil Badayani is always revealing. So poetry is not made, it is not manufactured, it is not beautiful statements, it is revelation. And it's a surprise that a popular lyricist like Shakil Badayani, who was very quiet otherwise, very humble, Naushad brought him to Bombay. And he did wonderful things. He died only at age 52. It was a loss for Urdu poetry because he was all the time revealing, and he was very close to the Hindu spirit also. Like Harin. Harin was a blend of the Persian and the Hindu. Badayuni was like that. A beautiful blend of, he can speak of Akbar's palaces and he can speak at the same time of Haridas Swami. Shakil Badayuni was a great poet in the line of Sri Aurobindo. And even in this popular Bollywood music, people have imitated and people have just transferred Sri Aurobindo's I Have 100 Lives in the songs. So that shows that there are poets. And in Bengal, what is this mantric poetry or the poetry of incantation? Something which goes beyond all analysis. Something which comes from the infinite and disappears into the infinite. Something which you cannot predict. Something which is not thought upon. And in Bengali, we have Jivanananda Das, the best poet in the post-Tagore era. And then Shakti Chattopadhyay. Like I have just quoted from Blake, if the doors of perception were cleansed, Shakti Chattopadhyay wrote it in poetry. What Blake said and Blake was his favorite poet. And Shakti Chattopadhyay was virtually a drunkard, but he wrote wonderful spiritual lines. And rhythm, as Sri Aurobindo points out, rhythm is the most important characteristic of a poet.
Absolutely.
Rhythm is, and rhythm can be inner, or rhythm can be outer, or it can be a mixture of that. Listen to how Shakti Chattopadhyay poeticizes Blake's statement in poetic statement in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Blake says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as infinite, as it is infinite, for man has closed himself up. And Shakti Chattopadhyay writes, বহুকালের স্বাদ ছিল তাই কইতে কথা বাদ ছিল. It was a long cherished dream that I will meet you. বহুকালের স্বাদ ছিল তাই কইতে কথা বাদ ছিল. দুয়ার খুলে দেখিনি ওই একটি পরমাদ ছিল. I didn't open my doors. That was my only mistake. So this is how Shakti Chattopadhyay has. He is a great poet, still neglected. And Jivanananda, of course, বহুকালের স্বাদ ছিল তাই কইতে কথা পাচ্ছ. I was ashamed of speaking to you because I rejected you. দুয়ার খুলে দেখিনি ওই একটি পরমাদ ছিল. I didn't open the doors. It was a mistake. I couldn't see you. I couldn't meet you. It comes from a poet who was, most of the time, he was drinking hard. So as Sri Aurobindo was extremely nice to Harindranath Chattopadhyay, he was always wanting Harin to stay back in the ashram. Now, even there are many varieties of mantric poetry is possible in the modern English poetry, in the modern vernacular poetry. But I will just end with one reference from T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is, otherwise we don't read T.S. Eliot. We have discarded him because he doesn't go with Sri Aurobindo's poetry. He's too intellectual, he's too objective. But there's a line in Westland which you will locate, which starts with two priests walking, and somebody else, a third man, is following him. And the poet sees that there is a third man, hooded, mantled, is following him. And he questions, and it's a sublime query. Longinus had said in the Sublime that questions contribute to the sublime. And it's a great identity query. Who are you? As in the Selfish Giant, the giant says to the guy, to the small boy, who are you? Who has dared to end you? This who, this question, this contributes to the sublime. And here also in T.S. Eliot is otherwise an intellectual poet. But even an intellectual poet can somehow verge on the borderline of Sri Aurobindo's theory of poetry. Eliot writes there, who is the third who always walks beside you? As I count up the road, there is always two. But who is there on the other side of you, hooded, mantled? Who is the third who always walks beside you? So you can feel the thrill in my body. It's great poetry because so you have to see, if you go by Sri Aurobindo's theory, that you can't expect things from somebody who can't give you something. You must expect from somebody who can give you something. But even from Eliot, you get this line. So this is the concept of Kavi, the concept of mantric poetry, and the concept of poetry which is to be written, which is being written in lines and isolated lines, as Sri Aurobindo had said, that such lines drop in rare from the highest of consciousness. So, but it will continue to come, and in evolution, there are sometimes back movements, maybe. But in spite of the fact, the recent trend is very, very optimistic. I have seen Muslim students, especially female Muslim students, are extremely responsive to Sri Aurobindo. In their WhatsApp status, I have seen lines from Rose of God. Can you imagine this? How they have taken Sri Aurobindo? And this is the only sign when we are upset by what is happening in Paris, in France. This is the only good sign that our female students are keeping rows of lines from rows of God in their WhatsApp status. So that's all for tonight, and I will answer your queries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghoshal. I think it was such an insightful session, and you really distinguished between several poets and explained us clearly what each one has to contribute, and really help us get an insight of Sri Aurobindo's poetry, mantric poetry as well. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Deshpande to take over the session.
Thank you very much, Harshita. I must really congratulate Goutam Ghosal for his most wonderful exposition of the poetry of Sri Aurobindo. It's an outstanding work, and he has brought out Sri Aurobindo in the most vivid kind of manner. I must really congratulate him for that.